Welcome everyone to the final webinar, I should say, for the UQ technical thrust area for USACM. It's a pleasure to have Ionut-Farcas, assistant professor from Virginia Tech. Ionut is originally hails from Romania and did his PhD at Technical University of Munich. From there, he went to being a postdoc in the Odin Institute at University of Texas and is now an assistant professor in the Department of Mathematical Sciences at Virginia Tech. And he's going to talk to us today about structure exploiting data-driven methods for large-scale UQ, a topic that is of great interest to many of us. So we're really looking forward to this talk. And without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Ionut.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael, for the nice introduction. And thank you for the invitation to present here. I'm always happy to talk about UQ, and this is really the right audience to do that. So today I'm going to give you an overview of some of my research on UQ. So the main topic for my PhD was UQ, and since then I started working also on some other things, but UQ remained and will always remain, a topic close to my scientific heart. So to give you a high-level overview of my research, generally speaking, I do research in computational mathematics and related fields, focusing on developing efficient algorithms such as data-driven modeling, including reduced modeling, uncertainty quantification, which is a topic of today, multi-fidelity methods, which I will also mention today, plus their scalable implementation with applications to real problems. So that's a very important aspect for me and my research. And example applications that I've worked on in recent years include fusion plasmas, which will be also featured today, and also rocket engine combustion and simulations of these, which I have done with Karen at the Ionut Institute during my postdoc, where we developed reduced order models for these applications. And my general interest, just to give you some keywords, so beyond uncertainty quantification, range from scientific machine learning, surrogate and reduced order modeling, including adaptive sparse read methods, data-driven modeling, domain decomposition methods. So I now worked also on this very prominently. Of course, the topics for today, uncertainty quantification, and more precisely, uncertainty propagation, sensitivity analysis. Also, I looked into assessing uncertainty in model predictions, which is relevant nowadays, especially for data-driven models, multi-fidelity methods, inverse problems, digital twinning, and of course, high-performance computing, which is the driver for most of these things. Today, however, I will focus on one aspect of my research, so some of my now a bit older work, but I hope still of interest for this audience, where the target is to perform efficient uncertainty quantification and sensitivity analysis in large-scale real-world applications where the simulations are very expensive and we are restricted in the number of simulations that we can perform realistically, even on state-of-the-art computing systems. So this is motivated by the fact that advances in computing and more precisely in high-performance computing are advancing tremendously. So this is a snapshot from the top 500 list of world's fastest supercomputers from a few weeks ago, where we can see that the first four machines, the first three in the US, the fourth one in Europe, are exascale capable. So they can perform on the order of 10 to the power 18 floating point operations per second, which is amazing and a lot more than was possible a few years ago, which means that with these capabilities available, we can achieve more realistic and accurate predictive simulations in complex real-world applications than ever before. However, even with these capabilities at hand, there are still things in computational science and in engineering that remain challenging, such as performing predictive simulations over extended time horizons on the scale of interest for engineering and scientific applications, and of course, many query tasks such as uncertainty quantification, sensitivity analysis, design optimization, and so on and so forth. So all applications for which we need an ensemble of simulations. So to give some examples from the applications that I work on that are computationally very expensive even on state-of-the-art systems. So when it comes to, for example, turbulent transport simulations in fusion experiments, these can easily require millions of core hours for a single simulation. Similarly, for reactive flow simulations for rocket engine combustion, can require of the order of 1 million core hours for a mere millisecond of physical time. So imagine if someone wants to do a multi-query type application, we need 1,000 of these. Of course, it becomes prohibitive to perform them even on state-of-the-art systems. Even more so from other communities, I noticed that the interest in UQ is becoming bigger and bigger. And nowadays, a prominent keyword is digital twinning. And in this direction, in the development of digital twins for engineering, scientific applications, medicine, and so on and so forth, assertive quantification, of course, plays an important role in many areas, many directions, ranging from data simulation, from propagating uncertainty in models that calibrated from experimental data, or assessing uncertainty in predictions for data-driven reduced models in case these are used within the digital twin framework. And here at Virginia Tech, we have a project that is part of the NSF MAT DT cohort of projects that started funding last year, where our goal is to construct a digital twin for a jet engine. So you see here a picture of the actual jet engine that we have in the lab, in the engineering lab, for which we'll start taking measurements and so on and so forth in the near future. And assertive quantification will definitely play a very important role here because we'll deal with real measurements and we'll try to assimilate those measurements into the computational models to enhance their predictions and obtain useful predictions in the end. So in this presentation, I will focus specifically on enabling assertive quantification and sensitivity analysis in plasma physics-related applications. This was the driver for this research. However, please keep in mind that the concepts that I will present here are broadly applicable, so there is nothing specific about them, about plasma fusion, but this was the motivating application for us. So we wanted to develop these methods and enhance them because we were dealing with complex applications that are, representative of a large class of applications in computation science and engineering. So just to set the stage to make sure that we are on the same page, so a very brief high-level introduction of what I mean when I talk about assertive propagation and sensitivity analysis, and specifically global sensitivity analysis. Well, I assume I am given a computational model that depends on some inputs, and a subset of these inputs, D of them, are uncertain. And I assume that this set of independent uncertain inputs is modeled using a specified probability density function. So this can come, from example, from a data simulation procedure or from some another related procedure. I'm given a high-fidelity model that depends on these uncertain inputs and possibly other deterministic parameters. And this high-fidelity model computes an output of interest, which for simplicity, I assume is a scalar. And in assertive propagation, the task is to propagate the uncertainty in these inputs through the model and obtain the uncertainty in the output. And generally, the way this is done is that to quantify how uncertainties in the input affect the output, we compute statistical moments, for example, like expectation variance and other related quantities. We'll also consider the task of sensitivity analysis, as more specifically global sensitivity analysis, where the task is to quantitatively assess the relative importance of the inputs and their interaction in the resulting uncertainty in the output of interest. Often in global sensitivity analysis, the output uncertainty is taken to be the variance of the output. And the reason why this is called global is because it considers the entire input parameter space. So we are assessing the relative importance of uncertain inputs and interactions thereof by considering the entire support of their probability density function. In the first part of the presentation, so we have two parts. So I prepared quite a few slides. So let's see how far we can get in the allotted time. In the first part, I will focus on a method for propagating uncertainty and for performing sensitivity analysis that is meant to be computationally efficient in the sense that it is meant to require just a small number of forward simulations that is based on what we call structure exploiting sparse grid approximations. And this was work done in collaboration with physicists because, as I said, our target application was plasma physics, even though the method itself is not restricted to this. from the Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics in Germany, Gabriele Merlo and Frank Jenko. All right, and the references for this work, so what I'm presenting here is the second paper, so a general framework for quantifying uncertainty at scale. The follow-up work that was published last year is a follow-up where we used the results from this first paper to derive, in addition to doing uncertainty quantification, to derive a surrogate model for turbulent transport, which, to our surprise, extrapolates very well. So it's plays a role of a generic a surrogate model for this type of turbulent transport, which can be extremely useful for practical applications plasma physics. So why is uncertainty quantification sensitivity analysis relevant in these types of applications? Well, these are the types of applications where computational models depend on input parameters that come from experiments. And oftentimes, these input parameters can be characterized by large experimental error bars. Also, it is generally quite difficult to robustly explain the observed behavior in experiments, especially when it comes to something like fusion plasmas, where obtaining high-quality experimental data is difficult. Also, oftentimes, for physicists, it is irrelevant to identify the most important parameters in a simulation, which is the role of sensitivity analysis. And also, we want to be able to explore regions in the parameter space that cannot be accessed experimentally, or it's infeasible or very expensive, or any other reason. Which, of course, the last one is the generic motivation for numerical simulations beyond uncertainty quantification. However, this is very non-trivial because for these applications, the high-fidelity simulations are complex, multi-scale, generally very expensive, even on supercomputers, which limits the ensemble size that we can simulate, and also generally the number of uncertain inputs can be quite large, which prohibits using standard methods that require a large number of simulations. So our solution is to use adaptive methods and more precisely adaptive sparse-read methods. So I did my PhD at Munich, and that's where the sparse-read paper was published in 1990 by the supervisor of my PhD supervisor. So that was a prominent topic at the Technical University of Munich. And it turns out that these type of approximations can be extremely useful for uncertainty quantification in large-scale applications. And what's the motivation for this? The motivation for us was to try to explore and exploit the structure of the underlying forward model in an uncertainty quantification setting. And what do I mean by that? In many real-world UQ simulations, we have models that exhibit structure, and by this I mean that even though we are possibly given a large number of uncertain inputs, typically only a subset of the uncertain inputs are really important. And these inputs also interact anisotropically, and typically these interactions are strong only between a small subset of inputs, and the others don't matter that much. However, in general, the structure is known a posteriori, so after the simulations are performed by doing, for example, sensitivity analysis, which means that if we don't have this knowledge, before starting the simulation, is difficult to exploit it. Our goal, however, is to build a practical, non-intrusive, data-driven algorithm that can explore and exploit this structure online. So without having any a priori knowledge about the underlying forward model, just given the capability to prescribe inputs and compute outputs, we want to exploit the fact that we may have only a subset of important uncertain inputs. And a picture of this is shown on the right of the slide, where I show you a two-dimensional function where that depends on two parameters, θ1 and θ2. θ2 is relatively unimportant, and essentially, even though this function is defined to be two-dimensional, intrinsically it is only a one-dimensional function. So this is what I mean that only a subset of uncertain inputs are typically important. So the way we'll do this is to develop an adaptive algorithm that preferentially refines the directions associated with the most important uncertain inputs and interactions thereof, which is to say we want our algorithm to emulate the structure of the input parameter space with respect to the model that we have, the forward model that we have in the uncertainty quantification problem. And we will do this by via sparse-read approximations. And without going into details, what are sparse-read approximations? So this is an example of a multivariate type approximation that cleverly chooses tensorizations of one-dimensional approximations. So most of multivariate approximations in approximation theory are obtained by tensorizing one-dimensional approximations. What makes the difference between a computationally efficient and a computationally inefficient approximation is the way we choose what terms enter in this tensorized multivariate approximation. And this is what spuds are trying to do. They are trying to be efficient in the way they choose these tensorizations such that the overall number of function evaluations that we need is kept as low as possible. To construct a spuds approximation, we need three ingredients. The first one, we need to prescribe the type of one-dimensional approximation that we will base this on. In our approach, we used a Lagrange interpolation, computing in terms of the barycentric formula for numerical stability. But other types of approximations can be used as well, such as quadrature or spectral projections or polynomial chaos expansions, as we refer to them in UQ. We also need to specify a point sequence to construct these one-dimensional approximations. So in our work, we use so-called Leia points. So Leia points, if you don't know about them, they are very similar to Chebyshev points, which we know they're excellent for one-dimensional interpolation. But the difference with respect to Chebyshev points is that Leia points grow slower as the polynomial degree increases. And Leia points were shown to be excellent for interpolation a while ago now. They also form a so-called interpolatory sequence, which means that at a given level, L, we have L Leia points with which we can construct a degree L-1 polynomial, which means that if I increase the number of points by 1, I can increase the degree of the polynomial that I can represent using the Leia points. After we have these one-dimensional approximations constructed with Leia points, we form one-dimensional hierarchical surpluses. So this is at the heart of most multivariate approximations obtained with tensorizations. So these one-dimensional hierarchical surpluses are formed because essentially these types of approximation are constructing using telescoping type approximations, like one would do, for example, in multi-level Monte Carlo methods. And then we proceed by lifting these one-dimensional hierarchical surpluses to d dimensions via tensorization. So that's pretty much the whole procedure for constructing this type of approximation. And then what we need, the third and most important ingredient, is to choose how many of these tensorized one-dimensional approximations we use in our spuds approximation. And this is given by a multi-index set, which is a finite set, a subset of n to d, that specifies which of these tensorizations we consider. So this, as I said, makes the difference between a computationally efficient and a computationally inefficient approximation in general. So this is the trick to our approach because we are constructing this multi-index set L, which dictates the overall accuracy, the overall efficiency, of our approximation adaptively. Specifically, we construct this greedily via so-called dimension adaptivity. So this is now a classical algorithm in spuds approximations based on the paper of Gerstner and Griebel from 2001. And the key to this algorithm, and in general to any adaptive algorithm, is what type of refinement indicator we are using. So how we decide what we refine in the next step in the algorithm. And the goal for us here, because we are tackling a UQ problem, we wanted to use a refinement indicator that is based on UQ information. And more specifically, we want to use sensitivity information about the uncertain inputs such that we indeed can preferentially refine the directions associated with the important uncertain inputs. So to give you a brief overview of the algorithm, so the way it proceeds is that it splits this multi-index set into two sets, O and A, where O is called the old index set, and this contains all the multi-indices that already visited, and set A, which is called the active set. So this sits at the boundary of the overall multi-index set. And this contains the candidate multi-indices for refinement. And the trick for us, so what I want you to get from this without necessarily going into details, is that key to driving our UQ-based refinement procedure is essentially for each candidate subspace for refinement for which we have an associated tensorized approximation, we are computing the squared L2 norm. And then by using the relationship between interpolation, spectral projections, and ensemble indices, from this squared L2 norm, we can obtain an expression for the variance surplus in that subspace, which boils down to nothing else but a summation of unnormalized Sobol indices, which then give us the desired UQ-based sensitivity information that we can use to drive the adaptive procedure. So what we do then is that we refine the subspace for which most of these unnormalized Sobol indices exceed the prescribed threshold. Because this is a proxy for us to say that in that subspace we have many important directions. So we want to refine it because this will be beneficial for the overall UQ procedure. And then we terminate this procedure when the sensitivity information given by this squared L2 norm for which you obtain this variance surplus falls below user-prescribed tolerances, or when a user-prescribed computational budget is exhausted, of course, because we are dealing with computationally very expensive applications. We also have to take that into account in case we can afford at most, let's say, 30, 40 or 50 simulations. So to summarize the procedure, we assume we are given a high-fidelity model on certain inputs that have a prescribed known probability distribution function, an output of interest that this model computes, user-defined tolerances because we have an adaptive algorithm, and also maximum computational budget in case we are dealing with a very expensive application. We are performing refinement as long as the tolerances have not been reached or the computational budget has not been exhausted. And then what we do in each refinement step is that we compute the sensitivity-based, UQ-based refinement indicator for each candidate subspace for refinement. We refine it, so we refine the one with the largest refinement indicator, so the one that contains the most useful UQ information, if you want. And then we perform the high-fidelity simulations corresponding to what we added after we performed the refinement step. And then after either we reach the tolerance or we exhaust the computational budget, we obtain the target sparse approximation, which gives us essentially for free statistics of the output of interest like expectation and variance, where again we can leverage the connection between from interpolation to spectral projections, and then from there to computing things like expectation, variance, and also sensitivity indices, more specifically Sobol indices for global sensitivity analysis for free. So we don't have to do any extra computations in terms of the high fidelity model. And what this does then is that this approach tries to explore and exploit the structure of the high fidelity model, but it is completely decoupled from the high fidelity code. So we only need the capability to prescribe certain inputs and then compute this output of interest y, and that's it. It doesn't require any additional information from the high fidelity model. So to show you what this approach can do in a real application, I will demonstrate its capabilities in a plasma physics-rated application that is characterized by 8 uncertain inputs. And without going into details, because if you're not a plasma physicist, it's not really of interest. What I want to emphasize here that the target application for was a real-world simulations that focuses on turbulent transport at the edge of fusion reactors, like a tokamak or a stellarator. And why is this relevant? This is relevant because in practice, understanding and quantifying the impact of this type of turbulent transport in the edge region of fusion reactors, which is called the pedestal region, is crucial for setting the overall performance of these devices. And needless to say, the input parameters that enter in these simulations, especially those that may come from experimental settings, can be characterized by large uncertainty error bars. So uncertainty quantification and also sensitivity analysis, when we have a large number of uncertain inputs, become very relevant in such applications. And what we have considered here, we have considered a setup where we have 8 uncertain inputs. So this is something that was chosen based on the application that we had here. So this was not an upper bound for us or nothing like that. So we had 8 plasma parameters that we had in this simulation. And these parameters model this type of turbulent transport for the D3D experiment. So D3D is the tokamak experiment of General Atomics in San Diego, and it represents the largest such experiment in North America. And what we did was to model these uncertain inputs as uniform random variables with bounds that reflect representative experimental error bars. And the output of interest in this simulation is the time average electron heat flow in SI units, so in megawatts, which is essentially what an experimentalist or a plasma physicist would like to compute in this type of problem. And a brief summary of these 8 parameters. So these are 8 plasma physics relevant parameters with variations with uncertainty bounds that are representative of experimental measurements. So we have an 8-dimensional problem for UQ purposes. The high-fidelity simulations here were performed with a prominent geokinetic code developed in the group of Frank in Germany. What I want to emphasize is the size of the problem. So we had a computational domain that was roughly 250 million degrees of freedom. And when we performed these simulations, we did these simulations on the Frontera supercomputer in Austin at the Texas Advanced Computing Center. And on the CPU nodes, so using roughly 16 nodes on this machine, which amount to 896 cores, at the time when I did these simulations, they required about 8,100 core hours on average. So this is roughly 9 hours of waiting time per simulation. Of course, this is not the most expensive simulation possible. However, for UQ purposes, imagining that we have to do 1,000 of these can become prohibitive from a point of view of a computational budget that we want to invest. So we definitely want to keep the number of simulations that we need to perform uncertainty quantification as small as possible. So in a setting with 8 uncertain inputs, for which a single simulation costs about 8,100 CPU hours, our approach enabled an efficient UQ and sensitivity analysis at the cost of only 57 runs. So why was this possible? Because this approach was capable of exploring and exploiting the structure of the underlying AD scenario. So what I show here on the plot on the slide, so the bars represent the subwall indices for the 8 uncertain inputs. And what you can see is that 2 of them stand out. If you look a bit closer, you see that 2 of them are also non-negligible. But then if you look really, really close, you see that a couple of them are actually unimportant. Which is to say, even though we had an 8-dimensional scenario, intrinsically this was a lower dimensional problem. So 2, maybe 4-dimensional if you really want to consider these, the first and the fifth parameter as being important. So this was what enabled us to do all this at the cost of only 57 runs, which amounted to roughly 460,000 core hours in total, which is doable on a large machine. If we were to use a full tensor grid-based approach with only 3 points per dimension, in an 8-dimensional setting, this would have required about 6,561 high-fidelity runs, which amounts to about 53 million core hours, which of course becomes very, very problematic. So what's the lesson here? That even in nonlinear turbulent transport simulations, which are very complex, we can efficiently perform UQ and sensitivity analysis when the intrinsic stochastic dimension is low, and of course, when the output of interest depends rather smoothly on the uncertain inputs, which was the case here. So what happens in these scenarios, which was a bit of a surprise for me when I started working on these, when people hear of turbulence, that's extremely hard. Plasma turbulence is even harder. What happens though, when you compute these derived quantities like an electron heat flux or something like that, in general, it can happen that this type of output of interest in the simulation can depend rather smoothly on the underlying input parameters, which is great news for uncertainty quantification and also for surrogate model development, which we exploited in our works. All right, so what we did here, we formulated a structure exploiting approach for uncertainty quantification at scale. The key idea is to drive the adaptive refinement procedure via sensitivity information. So this enabled us to explore and exploit the structure of the underlying forward model as a model of the uncertain inputs. And this approach is flexible and easy to couple with existing high-fidelity codes. It only requires the capability to prescribe certain inputs and compute the underlying derived output of interest. And we have demonstrated the capability of this approach in a real application focused on fusion plasmas, where we had variations in 8 uncertain parameters. And then recently we extended this approach, so we reused the results that we had from our uncertainty quantification study to derive a surrogate model that relates this electron heat flux with the 8 uncertain inputs that I mentioned, which evaluates essentially in milliseconds and gives an answer that would take otherwise hours of compute time. All right, so now let's move to the second part of the presentation. So in the first part, I focused on efficient uncertainty quantification using a single model, essentially, or using a single method that aimed to perform, the uncertainty quantification efficiently by exploring and exploiting the structure of the underlying formal model. And now we go beyond that and we focus on multi-fidelity methods, where the idea is the central research question here was, how can we effectively construct data-driven low-fidelity models to be used in a multi-fidelity framework for uncertainty quantification, and more specifically, multi-level Monte Carlo sampling. And this was work done in collaboration with several people, Ben Persdorfer from the Grant Institute, and my mentors and supervisors in Germany, Tobias Neckel, Frank again, and with my PhD supervisor, Hans-Joachim Bungartz. All right, so the relevant references here are the first paper is more or less what I'm going to present next. We also have a previous work that I have done with one of my former students from Munich, where we have investigated data-driven low-fidelity models for using multi-fidelity Monte Carlo sampling for fusion applications. And also part of this work started towards the end of my PhD and also made it into my PhD thesis. Okay, the starting point for this type of approaches are low-fidelity models. So an example is what we have seen before with the sparse read approach that I talked about. So when we are doing uncertainty quantification and other types of tasks, we generally have a high-fidelity model, which is typically a complex nonlinear PD model, large scale, computationally expensive, and we work under the assumption that this model achieves the required accuracy. However, oftentimes you also have low-fidelity models, which are less accurate, and they usually provide a trade-off between accuracy and cost. And examples range from data fit models, like machine learning models, to cause-rate approximations, classical reduced order modeling approaches, and also simplified or reduced physics models. And of course, some of them can provide tremendous speedups from millions of compute hours to milliseconds. Some others can provide a few orders of magnitude. But the point is, for many applications, we have this type of this range of models available. In the classical model reduction approach, when we are thinking about the reduced models or low fidelity models, the idea is to try to replace, and the keyword here is replace, the high fidelity model with a low fidelity model, which makes tasks like UQ and sensitivity analysis computationally feasible. However, what happens in this case is that when we replace the high fidelity model with a reduced model with a low fidelity model, the overall estimate depends on the low fidelity model's accuracy, which means that we need to trust this low fidelity model at least to a certain extent. So we need error bounds or estimates, we need certified low fidelity models, and of course, if they are not accurate enough for a task at hand, we need to refine or rebuild them, in a worst case scenario. And what happens in general is that these models can be fast to evaluate, but we cannot always, unconditionally trust them, especially when we don't have a notion of, how accurate they are. The same is even more true for data-driven low-fidelity models, because data-driven low-fidelity models can provide tremendous speedups. So one of the key assets of data-driven models, ranging from machine learning to sparse read approximations and everything in between, is that they are typically extremely fast to evaluate. So again, on the order of milliseconds or less to evaluate even for a high-dimensional input space. However, in practice, these models can require large training data sets, which can become infeasible in large-scale applications. And also, bounding the model error can be difficult in practice. So for many of these applications, we don't really have, strong theory. So our approach is then to, instead of relying on a single model, be it a high-fidelity model or a low-fidelity model, we combine hierarchies of high and low-fidelity models in a multi-fidelity framework. So the key word instead of replace is combine high and low-fidelity models, where the goal is to leverage the low-fidelity models for speedups, especially data-driven models that are extremely fast to evaluate, and we still keep the high-fidelity model into the loop for accuracy guarantees. And the idea is, or the goal is to, when we have this hierarchy of models, to evaluate the high-fidelity expensive model just a few times and put most of the computational effort on the computationally cheap low-fidelity models that are fast to evaluate. And what can happen is that in this type of approaches, in this type of multi-fidelity approaches where we use model hierarchies, even inaccurate low-fidelity models, meaning low-fidelity models that on their own would not be good enough to replace the high-fidelity model, can be useful in such a multi-fidelity approach. So we give a brief overview of standard multi-fidelity Monte Carlo sampling before talking about our contribution. So the setting that I'm going to focus on is computing the expectation of the output of interest that my high-fidelity model computes. So again, I'm given a high-fidelity model that depends on the uncertain inputs. I assume that these uncertain inputs are modeled as random variables, and I know their probability density function. And I'm given a computational budget P that allows M high-fidelity model evaluations. And my goal is to estimate the expected value of the output of my model. If I were to use a standard Monte Carlo estimator, given this computational budget with M samples, what I would do, I would draw M samples from the input distribution, evaluate the high-fidelity model of the M samples, and then compute a Monte Carlo estimator for the mean. And if I am to do a very simple error analysis, assuming that I don't take into account the bias introduced by the high-fidelity model, I obtain that the error for my Monte Carlo estimator, or the mean squared error, is equal to the variance, which is equal to the variance of the high-fidelity model divided by the number of samples. So this is great news because the dimension, so the number of inputs D, does not appear in the rate of the Monte Carlo estimator. The bad news is that this mean squared error decays very slowly, which is, of course, detrimental for large-scale computationally expensive applications because this means that we may need a large number of simulations to achieve good accuracy for this estimate. So instead of aiming to increase the number of samples that we need to use in the estimator, multi-fidelity methods, or at least the multi-fidelity method I will talk about, aim to decrease the variance, so the numerator of this mean squared error. So in multi-fidelity Monte Carlo, in the standard multi-fidelity Monte Carlo algorithm, these low-fidelity models are used as control variates with the goal of decreasing the variance of the underlying estimator. And the multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimator is a linear combination of estimators involving the high-fidelity model and the low-fidelity models that are weighted by some factors alpha. So these estimators here in this equation on the left are nothing else but Monte Carlo estimators that depend on starting with the high-fidelity model and then the remaining low-fidelity models that we have available. Importantly, two ingredients are important for low-fidelity models in a standard multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimator, namely their Pearson correlation coefficient, so the correlation coefficient between the predictions produced by the low-fidelity models with respect to the high-fidelity model, and their evaluation cost. So this is an important aspect. What we will do in the following for simplicity that we normalize the evaluation costs of these models by the evaluation cost of the high-fidelity model, such that that cost is 1 and everything else is relative to 1. So the total cost of this estimator is then essentially the number of samples weighted by these normalized costs. If we were to do the analysis of this estimator, we obtain that the error equals with the variance of the estimator, which is a factor that appears in the variance of the standard Monte Carlo estimator, weighted by a factor that depends on what? The correlation coefficients of all the low-fidelity models and their evaluation costs. And the smaller this factor is, the more variance reduction we obtain. The important thing is that this variance reduction factor depends on the two ingredients that I mentioned, namely the Pearson correlation coefficient and the evaluation costs of the low-fidelity models. Uh, However, what happens is that in the standard multi-fidelity Monte Carlo algorithm, the underlying assumption is that the models themselves, the low-fidelity models, are available and fixed, which is fine for something like reduced physics models or ghost read models. However, when it comes to data-driven models where we have control over the training set, for example, this then can become problematic because we don't know a priori how much data we need to train these models. So in the traditional in the traditional data-driven model reduction, we have data, we construct a surrogate model. Then if we are to plug this into the standard multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimator, we would just use statically the low-fidelity model, and then we would perform the uncertainty quantification procedure where we estimate the mean of the output of interest. However, an important thing to keep in mind is that we may want to have control, or we may want to know how much data we need to train or construct data-driven low-fidelity models. So in our approach, which we call context-aware learning of low-fidelity models for multi-fidelity Monte Carlo sampling, we leverage the fact that learned low-fidelity models in multi-fidelity uncertainty quantification play a support role in concert with other information sources. And our goal is to try to balance the accuracy of these models with the accuracy of the outer loop result in such a way that we construct these models to be sufficiently accurate for the task at hand. Meaning, instead of thinking like in a single fidelity setting where we aim to have an as accurate as possible model, here we are aiming to have models that are accurate enough for the multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimator. So in the standard estimator, we assume we have the correlation coefficients and the evaluation costs of the models, which are fixed quantities. In our framework, we need some sort of dynamic information because that will be the way for us to be able to construct these models in a way that makes them sufficiently good for the multi-fidelity estimator. So we assume that we have available the accuracy and evaluation cost rates of these models. So these quantities are no longer static, but rather we assume that we know how 1 minus the square of the correlation coefficient squared decays. So we have a measure of that, which we call an accuracy rate. And we also have a notion of how the evaluation cost of these models increases as the size of the training set, if you want. So we can think about the size of the training set as being this n here, increases. So as I increase the size of the training set for my models, I want to understand how their accuracy improves and also how their evaluation cost changes. So this is what we assume we have here. And then starting from the underlying multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimator, we can compute now the mean squared error as we saw on the previous slide for the multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimator. But this time, our correlation coefficient and coefficients and evaluation costs now depend on the size of the training set. And even more so, what we want to do here, we want to take into account the fact that it costs a certain number of high fidelity evaluations to construct these models. So we take this cost explicitly into account and we subtract it from the total budget, which is to say that in our framework, instead of assuming that the models are already available, we want to invest part of the budget in constructing them. And then after we construct them, we use them online for multi-fidelity Monte Carlo purposes. So my mean squared error now depends explicitly on this dynamic parameter, which is the size of the training set that I will use to construct my models, which enters here in the budget term and also in the correlation coefficients and the evaluation costs terms. And because I assume that I have the rates available, so I have the accuracy and cost rates available, what I can do now, which is really the main ingredient, or the main first step in our application, is to derive an upper bound of the mean squared error of our estimator that explicitly depends on these rate parameters. And what we notice when we derive this upper bound, which can be obtained by applying simple inequalities, like the mean inequalities, is that this upper bound has a prefactor and it depends on two terms, so two additive parts. One that depends on models up to k minus 1, where we assume that we have k models, and one term that depends on the current model nk. And by taking this into account, by having this additive structure, this means that it allows us to sequentially add models by minimizing the additional additive term. So the way we proceed in this case, when we have multiple models that we want to integrate into our framework, is that we start by determining the number of training samples for the first model, assemble the estimator, then we add the second model, optimize for the training set for that model, and we repeat this sequentially up to the point where we find the optimal training sample size for all k models in our estimator. So the key is to figure out what to do in the case with one low-fidelity model. And what we do is that we form an objective that depends on these rates. So this is just the upper bound of the mean squared error, where we discard all terms that don't depend on the size of the training set. Then we are able to show under certain assumptions that this objective, which is one-dimensional, so it depends on this n1, under certain assumption has the minimizer for this objective exists and is unique. And even more so, we managed to show, which is one of the important results for us, that again, under certain assumptions, the minimizer of this objective is bounded independent of the budget. So there is an upper bound for this minimizer that doesn't depend on the budget. And as I will show you briefly in some results, this implies that for multi-fidelity Monte Carlo sampling, the low-fidelity models can be too accurate, which is counterintuitive or with respect to what happens in the case where we do classical reduced order modeling. And these propositions can be used recursively if we want to extend the multi-fidelity approach from a single low-fidelity model to multiple low-fidelity models. And to satisfy our theory, typical rate functions that satisfy our assumptions are accuracy rates that are, for example, exponential or algebraic, which are very often encountered in practice. And the cost rates that satisfy our assumptions are cost rates that are algebraic with an exponent that's greater than 1. And even if models follow different rate functions, which can happen in practice, the computational procedure is still applicable. Only the uniqueness and global optimality is given up because of the assumptions that we have to make in our approach. Just to briefly give you an overview of the results in an academic example, and to highlight this idea that low-fidelity models can be too accurate for practical purposes, we just go briefly to these results. So we considered an academic example and a plasma physics example. I will just show you the academic example. So this is a heat conduction in a solid block where we have a static elliptic PD problem where the underlying domain is split into a 3x3 block. So this is a so-called thermal block problem where we have a piecewise constant heat conductivity field. And essentially the heat conductivity in each of these blocks is an uncertain parameter. So we have a nine-dimensional nine-dimensional UQ problem, and the output of interest is the mean heat over this bottom Neumann boundary of the domain. We have considered three models here, the high-fidelity model, which is a finite element model, and two context-aware data-driven models. One that is based on the reduced basis method. Why? Because we know that for this type of problem, reduced basis provide an exponentially accurate approximation, so something that is very accurate. And we also have considered a second low-fidelity model, which is a data fit type model based on epsilon support vector regression that we constructed in such a way that is not necessarily very accurate, but is a lot cheaper to evaluate than the reduced basis model. The idea was that we wanted to have two heterogeneous low fidelity models, one that is very accurate, more expensive to evaluate, one that is less accurate but a lot cheaper to evaluate. We estimated the rates for these models from pilot samples, so we know theoretically that the reduced basis approach provides an exponentially accurate approximation here. So we have obtained that as well. We also have estimated the evaluation cost rate. And what our approach said, so when we minimize this one-dimensional objective, is that as the budget increases, we only need at most 18 reduced bases to construct the low-fidelity model. And even more, as we observe on the plot on the left, that shows us how the optimal number of reduced bases increases with the budget. We observe that the upper bound for this is 18. So indeed, our theory applies, and we obtain uh, a bounded N1 star here that is independent of the budget. And now I will show you this plot and I will conclude. In this plot, I compare the mean squared error of the standard Monte Carlo estimator with the mean squared error of a static multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimator where I a priori construct the low-fidelity model without having any knowledge about how many reduced bases I should use. And finally, I also use our context-aware multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimator where I use the optimal with respect to the upper bound number of reduced spaces. And as expected, the multi-fidelity estimators, all of them are orders of magnitude more efficient than the standard Monte Carlo estimator. However, if we are to compare the last two lines, so on the left I show you the theoretical estimates, and on the right I show you the results that we obtained computationally. If we are comparing the purple line with the blue line, so the purple line is the multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimator where we have the high-fidelity model and the reduced basis low-fidelity model where the reduced basis model uses 50 reduced bases. This is an extremely accurate low-fidelity model, but its evaluation cost is rather high. The blue line shows our context-aware multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimator where we use 18 reduced bases, so fewer. However, we obtain a more accurate mean squared error. So this indeed shows us that even though we are using 50 reduced spaces and we get a more accurate low-fidelity model, this is detrimental for the multi-fidelity estimator because its evaluation cost is higher than that of the optimal low-fidelity model that we obtain in our framework. So indeed, the reduced spaces low-fidelity model computed using 50 reduced spaces is too accurate for multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimators here. Then if we add the second low-fidelity model, we obtain even more improved results, not necessarily by a lot, but we still get something, even though the second low-fidelity model is not necessarily was constructed to be very accurate on its own. But because of its evaluation cost, it became useful in our multi-fidelity framework. So what are the takeaways? Authority quantification remains a ubiquitous approach for real-world problems. And adaptive sparse approximations, as I showed you in the first part of our presentation, can be very efficient. Similarly, for context-aware learning of low-fidelity models for multi-fidelity Monte Carlo sampling, the outlook for us is to enable effective UQ and sensitivity analysis in problems with discontinuous or non-smooth quantities of interest, which appear, especially in plasma physics, quite often. And also, we want to extend the context-aware learning approach without having to rely on having accuracy and cost rates available. So we want to do this in an adaptive way. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Ionut. Very nice presentation, and we
Thank
will
you.
open the floor for questions.
Can I can I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, Susanta.
So I have a very small question regarding the cost of determining the number of that the cost function that you have defined, that the how many low fidelity model you will choose, right? So what fraction of the cost is computational cost is spent to determine that?
So the assumption here is that we have the rates available.
Okay.
So we don't take this cost explicitly into account. However, what we did in the paper I didn't mention here is that, so what we care about are the high-fidelity samples because those are expensive. So though the samples that we use to evaluate the accuracy rate, we can reuse in the estimator. That theoretically introduces a bias in the estimator, but what we noticed numerically in several examples is that that bias is small, especially when the number of high-fidelity samples that we need in the multi-fidelity algorithm is small. So indeed, this cost is not explicitly taken into account. So we perform this offline, but we are reusing the high-fidelity samples online when we are performing the multi-fidelity Monte Carlo estimation.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Ionut, you actually answered my question, and that was related to the bias between sharing samples
Yeah.
to estimate the correlation between the high fidelity and the low
Yeah.
fidelity. And so you do introduce this small amount of bias, but it turns out to be quite small, you said.
Exactly, especially when the number of high-fidelity evaluations in the multi-fidelity estimator is small.
Sure. If there are no other questions, we're actually right at 4 o'clock. So thank you very much, Ionut. This was a really nice presentation. Enjoyed it a
Thank
lot.
you.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.